Dire warnings mount as Russian forces dig in on Ukraine's border and diplomatic talks stall. Is Europe facing its biggest military confrontation since the Second World War? That remains unclear, even as military muscle flexing sends a signal of overwhelming strength. Some NATO member countries seek to alter the imbalance by supplying Ukraine with weapons and threatening Russia with sanctions. Yet a key European player equivocates. Today we ask, Russia-Ukraine conflict, is Germany letting its allies down? Hello and welcome to The Point. It's a pleasure to greet our guests. Michael Thumann is diplomatic correspondent of the Hamburg-based weekly Die Zeit, and his point of view: for Vladimir Putin, Ukraine is merely one aspect in the global showdown with the U.S. Alexander Rahr heads the Russian Industry Association in Germany and publishes frequently on Russian issues. His opinion: this conflict is much harder to resolve than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Face-saving compromises are not in sight today. And it's great to have with us Jessica Berlin. She is an expert on security policy and geopolitics, and she says Germany can no longer prioritize its economic interests over its international obligations. Jessica, Germany's new government is getting some of the worst international press this country has seen in quite a long time. Deservedly?
Absolutely. This is precisely a moment when Germany needs to lead. We are the largest country and economic power in Europe. We're the fourth largest economy in the world. And yet from the Kanzleramt, from the Chancellery, we hear silence mostly on Ukraine. This is truly a destabilizing factor right now for NATO's position with Russia.
Now, your opening statement implies that the new German government is prioritizing its economic interests in the sense of commercial relations with Russia. But former Chancellor Merkel was similarly inclined, and yet after the Ukraine annexation of Crimea in 2014, she played a very strong role in rallying EU member states around sanctions and also in initiating the so-called Minsk process of talks between Ukraine and Russia. So what's changed?
The government. Right now we have an SPD-led government, and the SPD, let's remember, is traditionally very Russia-friendly. Gerhard Schröder, the former SPD chancellor, sits in the board of directors of Gazprom and one of the leading proponents of Nord Stream 2. And this project, should it be cancelled, should the German government openly declare that it will be void if Russia invades Ukraine, this will have a real domestic political fallout for the SPD, for Chancellor Scholz's party. And these are the issues right now, unfortunately, in the internal debates in Germany that are being placed over our international obligations to lead on security and peace in Europe.
Michael, you say it's all about the showdown between Russia and the U.S. So does anything Germany could do actually matter? Would it make a difference?
Oh, yes, it would make a huge difference, simply because if we talk about all the possible measures the West could take if there was any conflict between Russia and Ukraine or a Russian invasion, in this case, it is above and it is Germany in the first row. Germany will have to put in his weight as an economic power. All the economic sanctions will be paid by Germany as the economic leader in Europe. This was the case in 2014, and this is why I think Chancellor Scholz should now speak up and actually live up to the expectations of an international role of Germany.
I want to dig deeper on sanctions and German attitudes a little bit later on. But Alexander, for a long time, there was a consensus in this country that Germany really couldn't afford to take a diplomatic Sonderweg, as they say, essentially to depart from the path taken by the rest of the West, by key allies. Do you think that that is changing? And if so, why?
No, it's not changing, but we have a challenge in front of us. We can solve the present crisis by military means, by strength, by pushing Russia back, maybe even with military means, with sanctions. But then we have to expect countermeasures from Russia, which could lead to a third world war. The other way of trying to solve the conflict is a diplomatic way. And I think that Germany firmly stands on the diplomatic path and will try till the end, if it's possible, to solve the crisis with diplomatic and not military and not other means. And why is the German doing this? Because I think Germany understands, maybe other than countries like Poland or Great Britain or the United States, that Russia has a point in questioning the present European security structure. Because as you remember, in 2008, the West was ready already to bring countries like Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And Germany and France vetoed this step and said there will be no place right now for these two countries as long as they have difficulties with Russia. And I think Germany firmly stands on this position right now. It will try to convince Russia that we have to cooperate together over a new European security architecture. But, of course, it is also willing, others and others, to listen also to Russia's argument that its interests and security objections are threatened by a further NATO expansion.
Germans have their own term for those who sympathize with Russia and with its president, Vladimir Putin. They call this Putin-Versteher. Nonetheless, few people here would have supposed that such sentiments would manifest themselves at the highest levels of the German military.
The German admiral in faraway India fired these words like gunshots, striking many Ukrainians right in the heart.
I think Putin is probably putting pressure on us because he can do it. And he knows that if he splits the European Union. But what he really wants is respect. We need Russia against China. The Crimea Peninsula is gone. They'll never come back. This is it. This is a fact.
The Ukrainian response was swift, with the Ukrainian ambassador firing back on Twitter. German arrogance and megalomania. The German government has to change its course towards Kiev. And Kiev's Major Vitaly Klitschko even complained that Germany had committed treason against Ukraine. Is Germany still a trustworthy ally to Ukraine?
I want to put that question in a moment to Jessica, but it's just worthy of note that Admiral Schönbach actually went even further than what we heard there and suggested that shared Christian values could make Russia a good ally for Germany vis-a-vis China. Jessica, let me just put that question to you about whether Germany is letting its partners down. It has categorically ruled out sending defensive weapons to Ukraine, and it's even blocking a shipment of German origin artillery from Estonia to Ukraine. How reliable is Germany as a partner?
Look, Germany's response was already disappointing. These comments from former Admiral Schönbach just added fuel to the fire. And now, just the other day, this announcement of Germany sending 5,000 helmets as military support to Ukraine, these kinds of misstatements and missteps only reinforce the very valid impression that Germany is not doing enough. Quite frankly, we are betraying our own responsibility as a leader in the European Union and in Europe with this kind of Selbstbeschäftigung, we say in German, this being completely consumed with our own issues, that we are not able to pull ourselves together and say, this is the role that we play in the world now. This is what the moment requires of us and what our allies need to see from us. We are actually weakening the position of Ukraine and all of NATO with our indecision.
Michel, critics say that Germany doesn't get the concept of deterrence, that it believes that by sending soft, let's say, medical supplies to Ukraine, that would actually have a deterrent effect. And I'd like to ask you whether you agree, and then also a question about the new coalition. But perhaps, would you say Germany just doesn't get it?
Well, I think Germany, of course, understands what deterrence mean, but I don't think that at this point in time, Chancellor Scholz is able actually to display what deterrence in both military and also in verbal ways and diplomatic ways means. What he has missed in the very beginning of the crisis is when he was already Chancellor, to speak up and to clearly say where is the red line of Germany. And he also has missed to assume leadership in Europe, as it was the case with Chancellor Merkel in 2014, when she brought Europe, which was also at a critical phase. There we remember the Euro crisis, but she managed to cobble things together. And Schröder is, at this point in time, he is just too silent. And this is the opposite of deterrence, because deterrence is not only something about military, but it's about diplomatic means to keep Europe together in this very sensitive moment.
Well, it's not only Chancellor Scholz, of course, who's making policy. The foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, prior to the election, had actually been quite outspoken in saying Germany needs to take a tougher line vis-a-vis both Russia and China. And if we look back a bit in German history, it was a Green foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, in 1999, who actually helped the Green Party break through its ideological pacifism and back the NATO bombing of Serbia. Yet, we're not seeing similar action here from Foreign Minister Baerbock, or could that change?
Well, I think she has done quite a lot in the past few weeks to actually make Germany somehow visible in the world, and especially in Ukraine and in Moscow with her visits there. The problem is that, in fact, in this moment, we seem to have in the leadership of the so-called traffic light coalition.
That's because the red for the Social Democrats, the green for the Greens, and the yellow for the Free Democrats.
Just for our exactly. Viewers. And the Greens and the Social Democrats simply lack at this point in time these strategically thinking politicians like Joschka Fischer at the time, who was able actually to pull around the course of his party. And even if you don't need to pull around, the question is whether you are able to grasp and actually then also to send the right signals out at the right time.
Meanwhile, Alexander, other NATO countries, with Canada and Britain at the forefront, but also including, for example, several Baltic countries, are sending defensive equipment and training missions to Ukraine. Do you think that's likely to deter Vladimir Putin or to provoke him?
I think the Europeans are looking for a common response to Russia's military build-up at the border to Ukraine. But if I may, I would come shortly back to what you asked about the Greens. To have a war against Serbia and Milosevic is something else than fighting Russia as a nuclear power. This is no alternatives. That's not possible. And I think there had been a lot of quarrels in the present government between Scholz and Baerbock. And at the end, Scholz could convince Mrs. Baerbock also to follow a more rational line, return back to realpolitik and not only follow the line of liberal values which have to be defended all over the world. And this is the change in the German policy which we witness now. And I think that Scholz hopefully will soon meet Putin and start a policy for Europe towards Russia, which will include also some kinds of arms reduction talks, where he has to push Russia too, because this is not going well right now. he also needs to reinvest a lot of power and energy into the Normandy Format, into the talks between France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine on solving the East Ukrainian crisis. And I think it is still possible to do it. The Ukraine has no other chance as giving the Donbas regions more autonomy, maybe full autonomy. Then it will keep its country together.
Donbass being the contested region in the east. Let me come to the Normandy Format, because in fact, Germany, together with France, has just co-hosted a new round of Normandy Format talks. These are the talks that essentially bring together Russia and Ukraine under French and German oversight, so to speak. They did talk for 8 hours, Jessica. Does that offer any reason to be optimistic that there might be a diplomatic solution? That certainly is Germany's line. They repeat like a mantra that the only solution here has got to be diplomatic.
I agree to an extent. Of course, it's always good news when the channels for dialogue are open. Everyone is still coming to the table, because all parties in this conflict know that war is in no one's interest. This, however, begs the question, then why did Vladimir Putin send over 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border? What does he want here? You mentioned earlier liberal values. This is not a question right now of values. This is a question of sovereignty and the rule of law. Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation, and Russia is currently threatening it. So this is the issue at stake. It's not a question of eastward expansion of NATO. It's not a question of a rehashing of the Cold War. Right now, a sovereign, independent nation is being threatened by a much larger, much more powerful neighbor. And in the Normandy Format and beyond, Europe and our transatlantic partners are looking to calm the tensions, de-escalate, but not give concessions for what is effectively geopolitical bullying of a free state.
Let's drill a little bit deeper on potential motives that might be seen here, and ask, where is this standoff heading? Since Russian troops started mobilizing, observers have been debating Putin's true motives and the likelihood of escalation.
Military images of Russian maneuvers on the Ukrainian border with a very clear message. Russia is ready to fight. In return, Ukraine has been mobilizing volunteers for a possible war, supported by an increasing number of Western allies that are supplying the country with weapons. The U.S. alone has now sent $200 million worth of supplies. Even redeploying American troops from Western to Eastern Europe is now no longer considered taboo. The arms race on both sides of the border is frightening young Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country in particular.
Yes, I can say it's kind of scared.
It's still dangerous here. It's scary, because throughout my childhood in Donetsk, I heard the war, shelling, tanks rolling through the city. When my friends and I went for a walk, which was not often, this is what we saw: tanks driving along and people holding weapons. So it feels like we are cut off from the rest of the world. Will Russia actually invade Ukraine?
So the question of whether Russia will invade Ukraine certainly appears to be approaching now the moment of truth, so to speak, Alexander, because President Putin has been waiting for the United States to respond to a written list of demands. And the U.S. has now done so, and apparently included confidence-building offers, including on restarting weapons talks, which you have just said is necessary. So are you really so certain that there is no faith-saving compromise in sight, as you said in your opening statement?
The faith compromise can only be, or faith-saving compromise, if NATO will not expand it to Ukraine. I think that Putin wants to crown his presidency, his long presidency for 20 years, to achieve non-membership of Ukraine and Georgia in his neighborhood. And as long as NATO will not give the guarantees of not bringing this country into NATO, there will be quarrels. But I think that there will be indeed some compromises. The talks and the negotiations will be prolonged, maybe endlessly. And through this phase of talks, confrontation may become less. And this is important.
Michael, de facto, everybody knows Ukraine is not about to join NATO anytime soon. NATO cannot take on a new member state where there's a conflict. It's as simple as that. Joe Biden has made it clear from the start that demands that NATO would formally rule out Ukraine ever being a member nonetheless are off the table, as are a NATO pullback from Eastern Europe and exclusion and withdrawal of U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe. As you said, this U.S.-Russia relation is what it's all about in the end. So what objective could Putin actually still be pursuing here? And if deterrence doesn't work, what economic sanctions would convince him to stand down?
Well, first of all, where is he up to? And I think it's not just Ukraine, but it is more. It is about the security arrangements in Europe since 30 years. It is precisely about, and you mentioned the question of the withdrawal of American nuclear weapons from Europe. I mean, there are not that many nuclear weapons left. There are just a few bombs in Germany, in Benelux, Holland, Italy. Turkey. So that is very few. And in fact, what Putin is intending by demanding the withdrawal of these weapons is much more. He talks about control in Europe. It's about hegemony, as he sees it, an American hegemony, which he would like to inherit. So this is the big picture. The other big picture is we see lots of maneuvers, military exercises by Russia undertaken at this point in time all over the world. So it indicates this global challenge. And I think this actually will linger on. And you asked me about the economic and the possible sanctions against that. It very much depends on what Putin does in this struggle. I don't know whether he really wants to invade Ukraine or just a small incursion, as Biden just said in a slip of a tongue. I think that Putin has lots of options on the table, and the response of the West has to be adequate, and it will be economic.
Jessica, two potential economic sanctions that could be applied, but both have provoked German equivocation. One is the so-called nuclear option, excluding Russia from the SWIFT payment transfer system, which essentially would make it very hard for Russia to get those oil and gas revenues on which it depends. And secondly, putting on hold, putting on ice the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany that essentially would allow gas shipments to go around Ukraine, depriving Ukraine of revenues. On both points, German politicians have equivocated and indicated that this might not be the way to go. What do you say to that?
That we're putting German economic interests in front of our international obligations. In the case of SWIFT, of course, this nuclear option sanction would be a huge deterrent to Russia and Vladimir Putin at this time. But Germany is considering the billions of euros in business interests that Germany has in Russia, and that this would also make it difficult for German companies and businesses to function. Secondly, of course, on energy, Europe in general, about 30% of our gas comes from Russia. In Germany, depending on the year, it can be upwards of 50%. We have created for ourselves over the last 20 years a huge energy dependency on Russia. On top of that, Nord Stream 2 was, of course, a pet project of the SPD, the party of current Chancellor Scholz. And to withdraw on Nord Stream 2 would have domestic political implications for the SPD. In short, we have put our domestic debates and our economic interests ahead of European united security policy.
Nonetheless, Chancellor Scholz has said Nord Stream 2 might be on the table if things go downhill, Alexander. If it were to be halted, the pipeline, do you think that would have an influence on Putin?
No, because we have to understand that Russia is diverting its energy flows to Asia. And Asia, China, but not only China, India, Iran, other big countries in Asia will never support Western sanctions, financial sanctions against Russia. On contrary, they will help Russia to overcome these barriers or this pressure from the West. And this is the danger which I see, that we will have, at the end, in the world politics, two blocks: an Asia bloc, which will be radicalized together with China against the West, and us, who will do everything to defend ourselves, or also act with NATO with NATO extension, which will only lead to a new Cold War. And I don't want to have a Cold War.
Let me jump here with one really quick last question that goes back to our title and essentially whether Germany's letting its allies down. Putin is known to be a masterful tactician. Apparently, he's concluded that this is a very opportune moment because of divisions in Europe and in the transatlantic relationship. Secretary of State Blinken is saying there's no daylight between the U.S. and its allies. What do you think? Will Putin believe him?
I agree with you that Putin is a master in tactics and strategy.
Will he believe Blinken?
He believes Biden.
He wants talks with Biden?
He will have talks with Biden, with Scholz, with Macron, and I think there will be a solution.
Okay.
Let's hope so.
It's an optimistic endpoint. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Thanks to you for tuning in. See you soon.